It's a great joy and pleasure today to welcome David Swanson, a pastor in Chicagoland, as our guest on Conversing. I want to tell you a little bit about him. David is the founding pastor of New Community Covenant Church, which is a multiracial congregation on the south side of Chicago. He also serves as the CEO of New Community Outreach, a nonprofit organization working to reduce causes of trauma and to raise opportunities for equity in Chicago. Before doing this, he has been involved in church planting, was the director of church planting, in fact, for the Evangelical Covenant Church. And it's today we come together because he's recently written a book that I am eager for all of you who might be listening to this to read. And today we have a chance to explore it. It's entitled Rediscipling the White Church, From Cheap Diversity to True Solidarity. David, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
You know, it's so interesting to think in my own life about the history of the Covenant Church, which I've never been formally a part of, but which has intersected with my life in different ways. A denomination that has deep Swedish roots and a history that is still alive and well in much of the covenant, as it sometimes is called. Much of the covenant is still deeply Swedish. And yet
True.
For listeners today, I just want to underscore that in the church planting and in the racial ethnic diversity changes that are happening in denominations, in fact, the Evangelical Covenant Church is making some of the most noteworthy progress in all of that, which is really quite amazing and wonderful. David, you're a part of that. But let's go back. Tell us a little bit first about your own years growing up, then segue from there into the denomination and how you even are a part of that.
Yeah, well, my dad grew up in the denomination, actually, in the Bay Area of California. His parents, my grandparents, were some of the first members of a covenant church there. They had moved from Minnesota, like other Swedes had, following jobs out west. And my dad received, his call to missionary service in that church, and became a mission aviation missionary. He flew little airplanes around Venezuela and Ecuador. And so that was my childhood, was growing up in Venezuela and Ecuador, up until my high school years, when we moved to the Southern California area where the mission was headquartered at the time. And so I do think that, that those formative years were significant for me in ways that I think I'm probably still understanding as it relates to multicultural spaces and carrying some sense of being a cultural minority. Obviously, in the context where I grew up, being white still carried plenty of power and privilege, but certainly that shaped me in some significant ways. After college in North Carolina, my wife and I moved up to the suburbs of Chicago to attend Wheaton Graduate School, and got to know the city that way, and got to know the south side of the city through some very close friends of ours. And for folks who don't know Chicago, the south and the west side are predominantly African-American sides of the city, the largest side of the city. And so really got to know and love Chicago from a distance at first, and then eventually was called by a covenant church that was a multiracial congregation on the north side of the city. And at that time, this would have been 2008, there were not a whole lot of kind of intentionally multiracial congregations in Chicago. There were a few. River City, pastored by Daniel Hill, who some of your listeners will probably know. And then New Community was another one of those. And Pastor Peter Hong invited me to come on as an associate. And so to be honest, I only learned that the church was a covenant church after the fact. I was much more drawn to the fact that this was an urban congregation that wanted to pursue diversity for the sake of the gospel, and was interested in planting more churches. And I just thought, what an amazing vision to get to be a part of.
Right.
18 months later, they sent some of us out to plant this church that I'm still out at today, and that's a story in and of itself. But I've pastored this church now for a little over 10 years in the Bronzeville community in Chicago.
So to some degree, you grew up obviously in a multiracial setting.
Right.
But an international one. And
Right.
Did that involve, in your case, was your family multilingual, or does it
Yeah.
English?
Yeah, I mean, I was 2 years old when we moved to Venezuela, and so my mom would homeschool us in the morning, and then we would attend Spanish-speaking schools in the afternoon. And obviously, all my friends were Venezuelan kids of my age, so that was normal for me. And now, thankfully, we moved from Venezuela to Ecuador when I went into junior high years, and Quito was a pretty bustling city. And so when we moved then a couple of years later to Southern California, that wasn't much of a culture shock coming from Quito to Southern California.
Right.
But I do have this real sense in my early high school years of kind of grappling with, as much as I could, what is race in this country? So these were the Rodney King years. These were the O.J.
Right.
Simpson years. These were the years where California state legislature was passing propositions that would have barred children of undocumented immigrants from attending public schools. And so that was kind of all in the air as I was making this transition back to the country of my birth. And I'm not quite sure exactly how I processed all of that, but I do know that also was formational in some way.
How self-conscious was your family of being a racial minority in a setting where they were obviously offering themselves in missionary service, in this case, aviation needs? But how was that a topic of conversation inside the family or not?
Probably not so much. I think we thought of ourselves obviously as cultural outsiders and minorities in a sense, but I think we were also pretty clear of the status that we carried with us. We didn't live in nice homes, but we lived in homes that were made out of cinder blocks, right, and that did have running water, and that's no small thing in some some areas of the towns that we lived in. So I think I was probably a little bit more aware of the privilege of our Americanness,
right,
rather than kind of racial ethnic distinctions.
And to some degree of class, I'm guessing.
For sure,
from
absolutely.
What you just said. Yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. And what would you say was the gospel to you as a kid growing up?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it was probably what a lot of American evangelicals would describe it as today. A sinner in need of salvation, and that means of salvation being provided through the death and the resurrection of Jesus. I think that's how we talked about it. I think that's how I experienced it in the little Sunday school classes I would attend, led by American missionary women. However, and I was thinking about this the other day. I was talking to a woman here in our neighborhood who attends the University of Chicago, and she's not a Christian, kind of seeking, and grew up in a Catholic family. And so she was asking me about my own faith experience as a child, and if I ever had a moment of walking away from the faith. And I described to her a family environment where I saw the gospel lived out in some pretty. What I mean to say is that for me and through my child's eyes, it seemed very clear that the gospel required a very different way of living, that it required certain sacrifices, certain decisions that were, I wouldn't have said this then, but were countercultural. In our case, that would cause a family to be in a different part of the world, right? And that wasn't held up as some sort of a we're special because of this. It was just very normal, actually. And so seeing the gospel lived out in that way, I think added a dimension to the way that we talked about it that filled in maybe some of the smaller ways that we might have categorized the gospel, so that I think my sense of the kingdom of God and sort of the requirements of our discipleship were filled in at a pretty young age.
That's a beautiful picture, really. So then you eventually return to the United States, and the door of life in the world opens in a different way than it had already been opened to you, in a very unusual way in South America. And I presume over that period of time, the gospel itself also is growing in your own understanding and framework. And so tell us a little about how that process unfolded and then how it was affected by where you were living and what kind of ministry call you experienced and so forth.
Yeah, so I do think probably those high school years in Southern California planted some of those seeds, some of those questions that I didn't answer for sure, and frankly questions that the churches we were attending were not grappling with, but they were there, and I reflected back on them. I remember, I believe it was my freshman year of college, when the second. The second Rodney King verdict came out, and I remember standing in our men's dormitory and watching these two very different reactions. It was a majority white school, though we had a number of African American young men on our floor, and just watching the differences in how people were responding to this, and thinking, "Now this is just interesting. What does this mean exactly?" And certainly then, as I moved into graduate studies at Wheaton, I, for the first time, developed an imagination for the church. Up until then, I had a very positive disposition towards ministry in general, and kind of thought maybe I would be involved in ministry in some way, but it was not going to be the church. I described the church as a benign necessity. It was fine, but it was pretty boring. It wasn't where the action was. And I had a professor who took a class, one class period, had one of these, two of these massive whiteboards, and kind of just charted redemption history for us, and located the church. And it was like, oh, okay, I'm seeing something here that I'd never seen before. And the church is much more than a benign necessity. It is, in fact, where the action could be. And so at the same time, then we were attending a non-denominational church, a relatively, from the outside, a nondescript church, but that was doing great ministry with women and men who were experiencing homelessness. And the pastor was this very down-to-earth guy who kind of, would share his life and story with me. And all of a sudden I started to see, okay, there's something here about a local body of believers and what it looks like to express the gospel in a particular place among a particular people. And I think this all starts to come together then when we make the move into Chicago, and I get to be a part of a multiracial congregation that is wrestling with how does the body of Christ itself, as its local expression, bear witness to what it is that Jesus has accomplished in the world. How does our very presence together, certainly what we do, but almost more so our identity and how we live together, how does that bear witness to Jesus? And then lastly, Mark, in the years following our church being planted, they have been racially charged, to put it mildly. And so seeing then that identity lived out in public as shaped in really profound ways by the African American congregations in our neighborhood and pastors who have befriended me over these years. And so having my own imagination reformed by, in this case, African American congregations who understand their distinctiveness in the world as the people of God, and how that calls for a certain gathering and nurturing of that gathered people, but also assumes the scatteredness of that people, that they will be there. There is we're going to be salt. In this unjust and racist society, we will have to exist as a preserving agent, as it were. And so that has been such a gift for me over these years in church planting.
Let me just gather up a few threads that strike me from that story. So we all know that right at this moment, that racially charged season that you're describing is still very much unfolding in the United States. But as you tell the story, there's also this progression, I would call it, in different ways over time through different expected and very unexpected moments, as well as patterns of things, that you get introduced to something, you get tastes of something that you didn't see in quite the same way. You build a new set of relationships over the course of that time. Your understanding of the urgency of the task that is before us is being changed in ways that I'm sure are both conscious and unconscious at different times. Now, alongside that, you've had, at least as an adult, this exposure to a denomination that was predominantly white and was pietistic, meaning that it was really oriented more toward the depth of a cultivated spiritual life internally and familially and socially in some kind of way, but was not thinking of issues of race as a frontline concern of discipleship. So you have that. Then in your neighborhood, as you come into this role, as you describe in the book, I think in a very beautiful and honoring way, this journey. And I guess what I want you to maybe just reflect on a bit more is that in a way, this book, Rediscipling the White Church, is in part your own rediscipleship that has occurred and then harvested something in your life, which is actually the instigating urgency of why you were able to see this. And I think the most profound part of this book that to me is landing in a space that very few people are talking about, and it's the reason, as I told you earlier, this is one of the reasons why I think the book is so helpful and important, is that you locate this debate inside a context of Christian discipleship, not as a matter of social, political, racial, sectarian identity. It's really about what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus, and how does our discipleship lead us into this? Not how does the surrounding culture of turmoil and of conflict and of injustice alone do that? The two interact for sure, but you root it in the discipleship journey. And I wonder if before we go on about that in the book, if you want to just say a little bit more about how those things began to really line up for you, because it's a profound journey.
Yeah. So one of the sort of strange and awkward conversations I find myself in somewhat regularly is with generally people of color, friends of color, who will say, David, how did you end up this way? And, on one hand, that could sound like sort of a cut down, but they're saying, how did you develop these interests and these commitments? And I offered that antidote, not to say that I've arrived anywhere, because I'm a long ways from getting anywhere. But I think you're right. I think that in my own life over these years, there has been this reformation that's happened, these lots of different threads. And what I've struggled with that question is being able to answer it in any kind of a succinct or helpful way. I've also been wary of trying to say, well, here's I somehow did, right, and make something exceptional, because I actually believe this is for all of us, right? That what the kind of lived solidarity among the people of God is actually what God desires for us, and is what makes the church so strange and so wonderful. And so I do think that was part of the project here, was trying to say, okay, so what would it then look like if a community were to say, we actually want this. We want to be reformed in such a way that we find this deep empathy and solidarity with sisters and brothers who in some way have been kept from us, or who we have kept from ourselves, based on the prevailing winds of our society and our culture. Not everybody's going to grow up as a missionary kid, right? That shouldn't be a requirement for rediscipleship. This should actually be doable within a congregation's life.
Right. And yet, really stretching back millennia, it's born into the New Testament. It's born throughout early church history. It continues, and we're re-exercising some of the old patterns over and over again, rather than actually maturing in some way that actually lives us and brings us into freedom. So I'm curious. Let's go to the core of the argument about discipleship. Why is this a discipleship issue, as opposed to, let's just say, a theological issue, or maybe even more just a spiritual issue? What makes it a discipleship issue? I think people really would benefit from hearing you describe that more.
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons. One, this is Jamie Smith from Calvin who makes this case so well. We're not primarily thinking or believing beings. We're primarily desiring and loving beings, which I think is that's just a Christian anthropology is all that is, right? We're embodied creatures. This is why Jesus comes to give us new hearts, to transform us from the inside out. We're not about, Dallas Willard says we're not about behavior modification. And so if we're going to be thinking about transformation, we need to think beyond simply the transfer of information. So, one of my mentors is Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil, and she says, I used to think that if I could just show white evangelicals in the Bible why reconciliation is God's heart, then that would lead to change behavior. And I understand that instinct. I do it in my pulpit all the time. I'll say things like, if you just really believed this, then you would well, no, that's not how it works, nice as that would be. So I think when we're thinking about discipleship, it allows us to think of whole life transformation. It allows us to think about, what are the actual dynamics that lead one's heart to be changed, so that I actually love new things and desire new things, because that's the level that we need to think about this. But the other reason that discipleship is really important is that discipleship is not strictly a Christian reality. We are being shaped and formed all the time. And I think sometimes white Christians have done okay recognizing this. Some streams of Christianity have recognized the way that greed culturally is really at work on us, or our culture's sort of interest in violence is really deforming us, right? But when it comes to race, we've not done so good at acknowledging the ways in which our racialized society, to use the language that Michael Emerson uses, is at work on us. It's at work not just on what we think or believe, but actually on what we love and on what we want. And so I wonder sometimes, does it bother the majority of white Christians that we exist in these segregated spaces? Do we even imagine something different for ourselves? Or do we just assume that this is normal? This is just how it is, and we don't even really want something different. So I think the lens of discipleship allows us to get at that holistic transformation. It also allows us to look really honestly at some of the more difficult cultural formation stuff that has actually carried a lot of weight in our lives.
So just teasing that out a bit more for people that haven't yet had the chance to read the book, if you approach it through a discipleship lens, what is different than coming to a congregation with that instinct than coming to a congregation that says racial unrest is happening in America? What do we think about it, and what are we going to do about it? What's the difference between those two things?
So one, it's deeply connected to our following of Jesus. It's not ancillary to this. And I think this is a mistake that we have often made, is to think that racial justice, that racial reconciliation is for some churches. And then other churches, they do, human trafficking, or they do care for the environment.
Potlucks.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And so it's a sort of choose your own adventure when it comes to issues of justice. And by connecting this to discipleship, I think what we see is actually this is an issue of identity, of Christian identity and Christian formation. I say this to our church all the time. Racial reconciliation is not one of our ministries. This is about our identity. And the Holy Spirit will bear beautiful fruit out of this identity that will look a whole lot of different ways, but we're going to nurture our identity as the reconciled people of God, because we exist in a particular society that's working really hard against that. So I think by framing it around discipleship, it makes that deep connection for us. The other thing that it does for me, though, is it avoids the tendency to reinvent the wheel, to say we got to throw everything out and start from scratch. And I read those books, and about halfway through, I'm just like, oh, I'm a terrible pastor. I gotta stop everything and redo everything. And in fact, I think the church across time and place has discerned particular rhythms and forms to our life together that have been really fruitful and have in fact exerted helpful formational influence on our lives. And so I wanted to think what might those discipleship practices, what latent potential might they hold for us that we simply haven't tapped into because we haven't seen this as a discipleship issue? And what might change then if we did see what I call the racial discipleship of our culture as something that needs to be addressed? Might we be able to reimagine some of the discipleship stuff that we're already doing in such a way that now we're actually beginning to orient people away from racial injustice and segregation?
One of the texts that has often defined all these conversations for me is the text in the opening chapters of Ephesians, where it starts with this portrait of being told that we were dead, but now we've been made alive because Jesus, who was dead, was made alive. And it's in that we are given new life. And then in chapter 2, it says, and the evidence, the proof in the world that we are those people is that we are part of a new humanity, right? So I remember not having grown up in the church in all the same way that you're describing your background, and being so shocked that the discovery that really was so evident in the Gospels to me as I started reading the New Testament, that to be a follower of Jesus meant a new sociology, right? That was, you live in a new set of relationships. That was actually both wonderful to hear and terrifying to me, because
that's right.
I wanted to be open to that, but I also had no idea what that would actually mean. So to me, there's been this historic slip between saying we want to be resurrection people, but we're not interested in becoming the evidence that that resurrection is real. Yes. And the evidence of it is an unexpected and otherwise unexplainable community of unlike people, right?
Exactly.
So in that gap, history in the church over time has always put other stuff in that gap. They might theoretically say, oh yeah, it's going to be like that one day in the new heaven and the new earth,
right,
on the other side of eternity. But today, that's all for later and some other abstraction. I'm just going to continue to live in the same sociology,
right,
and not let the gospel redefine it. Do you want to interact with that? How do you reflect on that text and what it says about our discipleship?
You know what that makes me think about is Paul's language, I think it's to the church in Corinth, about the abuse of the Lord's Supper.
Yes.
Because what is that abuse it's a class abuse, right? Mm-hmm. It's those who have more filling themselves up to overflowing, and then there are those who don't have enough to eat, who are also at that table. Now, from my vantage point, I think, well, wow, how horrible, that you stuff yourself before the Lord's Supper, that you might come in a little bit tipsy when you know full and well that the person next to you doesn't have enough to eat. And yet that was the status quo of their day. That was just the baseline. That was how society operated. And so all the Christians were doing was bringing the assumptions of their society to the table. And Paul will have none of it. I mean, it makes him livid. The language he uses about the desecration that's happening at the Lord's Supper is so strong. And I have to believe that the Apostle Paul would talk in very similar ways to us today, to those of us who bring along the assumptions, as you say, the sociological assumptions of our day, as though they were neutral and normal, and so can be adopted into the church. I think Paul would say there's no place for those assumptions in the church. And again, to go back to Paul and his language in Romans, we have in many ways conformed to the pattern of our racialized society, when in fact we have been called to embody this completely different sociology. And so that's what that's what breaks my heart is we in this country, there are so many Christians who understand this, who have understood this for hundreds of years, have understood the ways in which white Christians have not lived into this identity. And yet the segregating nature of race has meant that most white Christians have never heard those testimonies from sisters and brothers of color who could in fact bear witness to this, who could open up scriptures and show us this and make it plain to us. And I think what might be possible if we were to draw closer together, if we were to find a solidarity together, what scales might fall from our eyes where we would say, oh my goodness, the way we have been living has had way more in common with the prevailing winds of our society than with the expectations of what it means to be Christian together.
Just on a statistical level, most of the people that are listening to this broadcast will, if they are church attenders, will not be part of a church that would describe itself as a multiracial church.
Right.
They might be a church that could say there is some degree of racial diversity, but they wouldn't believe that multiracial identity is part of the church's experience. So now you're the pastor of a church that is quite deliberately, self-consciously, purposefully styling itself to be that. So give people who have never perhaps experienced that and wonder what those words even mean in light of what you were just saying. What is that we're even talking about? And then how does it work?
Yeah, so I want to say two things about that. One, I am so thankful to be in a multiracial church, and I hope to live and serve and die in one. It looks like shared leadership. It looks like conversations about the differences in cultural experiences and being intentional about singing and praying and serving and leading and starting worship services at certain times, right? That makes space for I use the word hospitality, that allows a church to be hospitable to everyone who may be called to that congregation. And there's particular difficulties about this, particularly for those of us who are used to being in the cultural majority and are used to seeing our own experiences being neutral. So part of what being white in a multiracial, multicultural church means is coming to see that I'm not neutral, that I have cultural preferences like everybody else. And so it allows for I think an experience of the gospel that is very unique in our society and in our culture. I think that one of the mistakes that Christians can make in this moment, especially as there's so much conversation about racial injustice, is that somehow our society is more advanced when it comes to racial reconciliation or justice than the church. I actually don't think that's the case. I think that our culture in some places talks a good game, but is actually very content with the status quo and our segregation. And so a multiracial church has the experience of being quite unique and quite odd in its surrounding society. But the other thing I want to say about that, Mark, is that one of the shadows of the multiracial church movement over the past, I think, 15 or so years is that it has been the only tool in the toolbox. And so when we've talked about addressing racial inequity in our church, it's always been churches like mine that have been lifted up. And, our denomination has done that. And there's good things about that. It's nurtured some of us. But what it does is it leaves the vast majority of white pastors and white churches on the sidelines going, well, I like that. And I'm really happy for you, David, but my town is mostly white, my suburb is mostly white, my church is mostly white, and so I have no role to play in this. And that was really one of the strong push factors for me in this book, is wanting to flip that paradigm and say, in fact, our white churches have a really important role to play in the movement for reconciliation within the body of Christ. And so the language of discipleship and then solidarity, I think, gets us closer to where every congregation, no matter where it's located, what the demographics are, can say, God has actually called us to play a really important role in bearing witness to the reconciliation that Jesus has accomplished for us.
I was once a participant and leader in a small group that was forming in Southern California, and it was happening in a certain community, and we were trying to draw as diverse a group of people from that particular community as possible. And the person that was co-leading it with me, who lived there and knew the community very well, said, well, there's really no racial diversity here. And because I was a relatively new Southern Californian at that time, I thought, really? I didn't know there was any place in Southern California that wasn't racially mixed. So I didn't want to pounce. I did my research, and I discovered that the community that he was living in was 35% racially non-Caucasian. Mm-hmm. And so I said, this is not a gotcha moment. I'm not trying to catch you out at all. I'm just saying, why is it that when we've been talking about forming this group and you live in a town that has 35% non-Caucasian, that you would say there's no racial diversity? We're not yet to the question of how would any of those people ever become part of this group? Mm-hmm, that's a different question. Mm-hmm. Are you saying that you just took it for granted that they would have no interest, therefore you'd already discounted them, or that you don't see them? Honestly, I knew him well enough to be able to just say, which is it? And he gave me an answer then, but he came back later and he said, that was true, but But the more I thought about it, the more I have to say, I don't see them. I have decided not to see them because they're not in my purview. They're
Right.
not the people that, quote, count in whatever way that might be relevant.
Right.
And
Right.
that became actually the pretext of some really great discussions and reflections. It eventually did emerge in a really highly multi-ethnic group in that community of people who, by all of their own admission and coming from every direction, that they had been in these kinds of groups in other places, but never in this location.
Yeah.
Right. And I think what I want people that are listening to this interview to think about is that you may feel as though you are in a more homogeneous context than is actually true.
That's right.
That's not true everywhere, but it may be more true than you even really think. And certainly an example like your church, David, and other such examples is bringing to light something that was present for some time already, and certainly in Brownsville and otherwise, it would be very clearly a multiracial but largely African American Black community. And I just think that there's so much of that basic education about our own environment and our own awareness of what are the actual demographics of the town that I'm living in.
Yeah.
And in a number of different ways and categories, right? And how could real relationships, actual community be built with as little agenda as possible, except knowing each other?
That's so good. And I mean, I think about that a lot because you're right that oftentimes our environments are far more diverse than we think they are. And that is the deforming influence of this racial discipleship. It conceals things from us. There's an intent behind that. And I try to get into that in the book. But then even in those locations that really legitimately are racially homogenous, there's questions to be asked about why that is. And the answers are always very, very disturbing. The histories of redlining or racial exclusion or racial expulsion or, laws on the books in counties or entire states. And that our churches need to understand that history. Like we need to be the keepers of that memory, right? We are the rememberers and those who are not afraid to remember those difficult and those hard things, because remembering that history explains to us why the geography looks the way that it does today. It tells us something about that. And if we don't understand that, then we misunderstand and assume that it's neutral. That this is an accident of personal or cultural preference, when in fact there's malicious intent and history behind it. The very kinds of things that the people of God would say, this is not neutral. This had a malicious edge to it, and we need to live in such a way that is opposed to that, is resisting that in some way, it is fostering a more hospitable environment, contra to what came before us. But when we don't know those histories or those stories, we make these assumptions that, frankly, don't really hurt me in any real way, but have had profound damaging effect to sisters and brothers with whom I share faith.
One time I was speaking at a Christian conference center that I arrived at late at night. So I was unfamiliar with it, and I don't know anything about the demographics of the people that live in the area of this conference center. So on the way there, the person that was driving me was telling me the history of this conference center and how in the 60s there had been a very major change that had broken them free from the racism that had defined them before, where it was really quite explicitly a whites-only camp. And what a significant thing that was, and how pleased he was that history had changed. So I go to bed that night thinking, wow, great, wonderful, that's amazing. And so I was curious the next morning to see how this unfolded in the presence of whoever it is that was going to show up for the Sunday morning that I was preaching. And there were a lot of people there, thousands of people. And I only saw one African American, and he was my friend who had come to be at the conference. Now, I really, of course, in a cheap way, it's easy to be a critic of such, if not a cynic of such things. But what got me was later when he was driving me back to the airport, and it turned out that the community that was immediately around was completely African American and Latino, like densely African American Latino. But inside, having fought for justice
Yeah.
It was an all-white community of people who gathered in isolation. And I think somehow seeing that as a discipleship issue, like
Yeah.
what does this mean in terms of our discipleship is the point, not who gets to feel worse and
That's right.
bad about
That's right.
whatever they think and feel.
That's right.
What does this hold up to us as a mirror of something that does not look, in my understanding, like the Jesus that we claim to follow?
Yeah.
It doesn't have the compassion, the understanding, the relational commitment to be present in one another's lives. And this conference center had an elaborate worship. It had elaborate facilities. It had a marvelous history in many different ways. But this disconnection, which is, I think, how they would see it, it was like there wasn't a connection as opposed to there being an opposition. I can't really speak to that. I'm just going to say their representation of it was, it's a disconnection. Well, it was certainly a disconnection. That was whatever else you could say about it. It was a disconnection. And I've lived in those disconnected places. And
Absolutely.
I've served in those disconnected
Yes.
places. And Fuller can be a disconnected place in various ways, despite all of our international and racial ethnic diversity inside. So it can still be a disconnected reality. And Fuller, in its discipleship, has a long way to go to keep learning these lessons. I have a long ways to go. The people that we're forming as students and learners have a long way to go. David, I have to bring this conversation to a close, but I just want to say again to those who are listening how valuable I think you would find this book. Again, the title is Rediscipling the White Church, From Cheap Diversity to True Solidarity. David, what you've described is that kind of true solidarity. So thank you very, very much for sharing your story and giving us a taste of things that we need to think about, pray about, and even more specifically, actually enact. So thank you very much for being our guest.
You're welcome, Mark. This was really a pleasure. I appreciate the conversation. Thank you.